Is there something wrong with the aviation industry in the United States right now? If there isn't, then what's the reason for all of these close calls, which keeps happening all the time, it feels like?
Our safety system is showing clear signs of strain that we cannot ignore.
Well, it turns out that the country's airline industry is undergoing some real changes at the moment. And when there are rapid changes, there are also changes of mistakes being made.
The concern here, and it's a real concern, is that one of these close calls could be something far worse.
Stay tuned. A few months ago, I made a video where I highlighted a number of quite worrying close calls who seem to be occurring with increasing frequency over in the United States. As I explained in that video, a few eye-catching news stories like Southwest's complete meltdown over last year's Christmas plus a runway incursion at JFK increased the public's awareness massively about this. This meant that several subsequent events also got a lot of attention, suggesting that something serious was indeed going on. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that these close calls and other incidents weren't serious or worth investigating. I'm sure they were, but as I explained, before those ones occurred, there had already been a few earlier incidents that didn't get nearly as much attention as these new ones did, despite being just as serious or in some cases even worse. Now, one common theme in these stories that really annoyed me was the implication that the standards of new pilots were getting lowered as part of some kind of woke agenda to put less qualified pilots into the cockpit to satisfy some sort of minority quotation.
All the hiring for the new pilots, the main focus is going to be diversity. What?
Now, I don't want to get into a rant here, but what I will simply say is that in order to start flying passengers, all new pilots are checked out by other pilots. Now, I know quite a bit about this because that's been my job for the last 18 years in my airline. We check airmen know very well that when we check out someone for the right seat in the cockpit, a few days later this person might well end up flying my family around. So do you really think that we would sign off on somebody we don't think is good enough just to satisfy some kind of random metric in recruitment? Well, I think that I can speak for almost all Czech airmen when I say that we would never do that. The gatekeeper role is far too important for that. Now, if the standards are slipping on the recruitment stage, well, then this is something that we have to address. But I think that I can speak for all of my colleagues when I say that we won't allow any standards to be lowered just to satisfy any kind of new hiring metric. I guess actually that was a bit of a rant, wasn't it? Anyway, there's much more to this, including the debate about whether or not pilots really need to have 1,500 hours before they're safe to fly for the airlines, something that I personally believe is bullshit, but I've done a separate video on that you can check out later on. Now, in the video that I did previously about the incidents that happened back in 2023, we still didn't know anything about the flight hours of the pilots involved. But in the past few months, the NTSB has published its final report on a couple of these events, which included some really interesting information about the experience levels of those pilots. For example, in an incident that happened in Boston in February this year, two pilots flying a Learjet 60 started their takeoff roll while a JetBlue Embraer 190 was about to land on a crossing runway. The crew of the JetBlue flight went around, passing only 400 feet above the Learjet, and a jump-seater in the JetBlue Embraer, himself an Airbus A320 first officer commuting to work, captured the whole thing on his iPhone, and it is terrifying. The investigation showed that the air traffic controller had only cleared the Learjet to line up and wait, but its crew misunderstood and took off anyway.
Middle land 4 right, JetBlue 206.
The first officer, who was pilot flying, had 2,027 hours, and he said that he was concentrating on making sure that he entered the runway correctly before asking the captain if they were actually cleared for takeoff. The captain, who was in charge of the radio, said yes, and he had 22,544 flight hours at the time of that incident. Afterwards, the captain said that he probably read back the line-up and wait clearance to the tower, but he also added that, in my mind, I was cleared for takeoff. I cannot understand what happened to me during the clearance. The only thing that comes to mind is that the cold temperature in Boston must have affected me. I was not feeling completely well and had a stuffed nose. Now this is a runway incursion, and when that happened, the Boston Tower controllers received an alert from their surface detection equipment. But unfortunately, by the time that the JetBlue crew got the go-around instruction from the tower, they already saw the Learjet crossing in front of them and had already decided to go around. Now, they did a normal go-around and then came back in and landed safely after that. We've also received the final report on United Airlines Flight 1722, which happened in December last year near Hawaii, which I've already covered in detail over on the Mentour Pilot channel, by the way. In the case of that event, the experience of the crew was much more relevant to how they handled this upset and brought their diving 777 back under control. Both of them were actually experienced pilots. The captain had 19,600 flight hours in total, while the first officer had around 5,300 hours. But here, the total number of hours is less important than the hours each pilot had on the type that they were flying. Now, I'm not going to analyze all of that here since I've already done that over on the main channel, but what I need you to focus on here is that even though the captain had 5,000 hours on the 777, only 300 of those hours were flown as pilot in command. And it is also likely that he had flown the Airbus A320, which is a completely different type, between his transition from the right to the left seat of the 777. These transitions between different aircraft types and between right and left seat may well matter more when it comes to the errors in handling the aircraft than just simply the number of total flight hours. And that is the first good explanation that we have for why there might be an increase in aviation incidents over in the US. You see, during the pandemic, a lot of senior pilots around the world decided to retire early rather than to wait for the industry to recover fully. Many of these pilots were close to mandatory retirement anyway, and with the incredible increase in the stock market prices during the last decade, some of them could easily afford to retire early. And on top of that, in the case of some younger pilots who were furloughed during the pandemic, they actually found other jobs, and a significant number of them simply decided to stick with these new jobs rather than to return to the cockpit when the industry recovered. Turns out that getting a taste for something else, like time off during Christmas, watching your kids' football games and summer vacations, can sometimes have that effect. But what this all meant was that there suddenly was a lot of movement and openings in the pilot ranks, meaning that many existing pilots had to retrain or to fly on different aircraft types, and even going from regionals to long-haul operations very suddenly. Airlines and their pilot unions in the United States have really rigid rules normally around seniority list and who flies what aircraft type, but sudden departures of unusually large numbers of pilots can upset these rules and systems. And while, for example, United didn't retire any aircraft types in 2020, other airlines in the United States did, and obviously that created more pools of transitioning pilots. On top of that, the current overall lack of pilots in the United States means that pilots are now finding themselves much quicker in the majors, flying into very complex big airports and in much more complex operations earlier on in their careers. But movements of pilots is only one side of the equation here. To get to the bottom of all of these close calls, another side that probably matters even more has to do with air traffic control. And I will tell you why, and how all of this might be connected to an airport manager going door to door, ringing doorbells in a quiet neighborhood in Connecticut, after this. When my team and I were researching these close calls in the US, we came across several geo-blocked websites and news articles, which is a real pain when you're trying to find out details. But fortunately, we had a trick up our sleeve, which is today's sponsor, NordVPN. With Nord, we could virtually move our location to the US simply with a touch of a button on the app, and voila! All of the articles were suddenly available to us. But Nord can do much more than just granting you access. They can also act as your shield against hacking, malware and other nasty cyber stuff through the help of their powerful cybersecurity features. And, of course, they can also help you to watch your favorite content wherever you are in the world. Now, if you don't want to take my word for it, but instead want to try it out for yourself, then use the link here in the description below, which is nordvpn.com/mentornow. That will give you 4 free months whenever you sign up for the 2-year deal, and there's no risk involved since Nord always gives you a full 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Nord. Now let's continue the story. The FAA and others in the industry agree that runway incursions are a rising trend, which must be addressed as soon as possible.
We've gone from a rate from a number of about 8 to 10 of the serious runway incursions each year up to just under 20 per year. So they are on the rise.
Now, since my last video on this subject, there has been at least one more similar incident, and this time in San Diego, California. That one also involved a business jet and an airliner, like the incident in Boston in February, but in San Diego, the business jet was the aircraft landing, while the airliner, a Southwest 737 heading for San Jose, was the departing one. But the important difference here is that this incident doesn't appear to have been the fault of any of the pilots. A controller in the tower instructed the Southwest crew to line up and wait, informing them of landing traffic that was at that moment about 5 miles out. That traffic was the business jet, the Cessna Citation, and at this point the same controller had already cleared this aircraft to land on the same runway. About 2 minutes later, the pilot in the business jet asked if they were still cleared to land, and at that point the controller realized what was about to happen and told them to go around. They did, getting as low as 100 feet above the runway, overflying the Southwest 737 in the process. Now, many observers pointed out some obvious similarities between this and another incident that happened last February in Austin, Texas, between a Southwest 737 and a FedEx freighter. In that one, the Southwest 737 was cleared to take off before the FedEx 767 was cleared to land, also on the same runway. The Southwest pilots took a bit longer getting ready to depart than the controller anticipated, and in the end, the Southwest aircraft took off just as the 767 went around above it. But that incident happened in low visibility conditions. The one with the Southwest and the Cessna Citation in San Diego happened in better weather, and in that case, as with the JetBlue incident in Boston, the San Diego tower controller got a warning from the automated surface surveillance system which detected the unsafe condition. Now, the fact that these systems exist is really important, as you can see, and the NTSB has been calling for more of them to be installed. It is great to see that these systems can do their job, and also to see pilots being situationally aware and acting the way that they did here, but these type of incidents shouldn't happen in the first place, and inevitably, when they do happen, a lot of attention goes to air traffic control. Now, that's completely understandable and correct, but it's a little bit unfair to do so without putting the work that these guys do in the right context. Looking at these events from here in Europe, something that sticks out and that we normally never do in Europe is seeing aircraft getting cleared to land while another aircraft is still on the runway. That just doesn't happen here. But to explain why controllers in the United States are doing this, it's important to consider some basic differences in the way that commercial aviation works in the United States versus Europe. Here in Europe, most flights are point-to-point, meaning that they fly directly between smaller destinations without stopovers, and that means that the flights are generally much more spread out since they don't have to go through any larger hubs. Of course, there are still bottlenecks, as anyone flying near London knows all too well, but for the most part, Europe, which has over twice the population of the United States and twice the population density, has a fairly decentralized point-to-point air traffic network, which means less pressure on the air traffic controllers. By contrast, the vast majority of flying in the United States still involves the use of a more centralized, multi-tier organizational model which relies on mainland and regional connections at larger hubs, even for domestic flights. This is why in some busy, more densely populated areas in the US, like New York for example, you can hear air traffic controllers who speak faster than auctioneers or horse racing commentators because they really just have to do that due to the mad traffic density. But while tens of millions of people live in and around New York and New Jersey, many passengers flying through JFK, LaGuardia and Newark are just transitioning through, adding to the density. Now the same is true for busy hubs like Chicago, LAX, Denver, Atlanta and others, depending on which airline you pick to fly for. All this means that, like the country's population, air traffic control in the United States is a much less homogeneous affair, which can be a lot harder to rejig and readjust after a massive upset, like the pandemic was. Now, that would be the case even if aviation in the US continues to use its current hub and spoke operating model, but that might not be the case. And this is where we get to Connecticut and that airport manager I mentioned previously who was knocking on people's doors in a quiet neighborhood. His name is Sean Scanlon, and this happened in 2021 when he was the executive director for New Haven Airport. Until then, this very small airport only had one weekly commercial flight to Philadelphia, which was served with a regional jet on behalf of American Airlines. The rest of New Haven's airport traffic was corporate or just general aviation. But the reason Mr. Scanlon was ringing people's doorbells was because of plans to expand the airport with a new terminal and a longer runway to introduce much more regular flights. Now, getting locals on board for those kind of plans is a really delicate process that could include discussions on noise abatement procedures or even plans to soundproof people's homes, which have been done in other airports before. This was the reason he was ringing people's doorbells, to try and drum up some support for this idea. So why would this quiet little airport suddenly need this expansion? Well, it turns out that a new startup called Avelo Airlines wanted to start up and actually has since gone ahead and started offering services from New Haven to destinations in, for example, Florida. Initially, they were using Boeing 737-700s, but they've also later introduced 800s, and currently the airport's runway is still just 1,707 meters or 5,600 feet long, which is on the tight side for a 737-800, and that's one of the reasons why expanding the airport and runway would come in quite handy. But more importantly for our topic, Avelo's business model of connecting small airports directly with popular sunshine destinations in Florida isn't how most of the country's airlines have been working so far. Unlike most US airlines, Avelo is actually basing these planes in one airport, in this example, New Haven, so that its planes and its crews make round trips from there rather than rotating around main hubs. This is, by the way, exactly how a lot of European low-cost airlines are already working and have been doing so successfully for decades. And Avelo isn't alone in trying out this model. Breeze Airways is another, bigger startup launched by David Neeleman, who previously co-founded several very well-known leisure airlines like JetBlue and WestJet. BreezeJet's operating model is a bit more complicated because they have a mix of old and newer planes, but they rely on a very similar principle. And it's not just startups doing this. Frontier is right now in the process of shifting to this operating model as well, according to some analysts. All of these airlines are following the example of Allegiant Air, who has been using a similar fixed base working model for years, avoiding direct competition with the likes of Southwest by doing so. So, what does this have to do with air traffic control and close calls? Well, air traffic control has to adjust its capacity depending on where the demand is, and that is going to be a challenge if the operating models of the airlines are constantly changing. Aviation isn't, as we all know, a static environment, and during 2020, many airlines, including JetBlue and Southwest, were trying out some new ideas. Basically, any airline that still had good liquidity during the crisis tried to move into new markets, as larger airlines with shakier finances were unable to react to it. Meanwhile, the FAA was facing its own budgetary problems, which translated into staffing shortages on many positions, including air traffic control. These problems continue to this day, with a hearing in the US Senate about this on the 9th of November this year. Most people agree that ATC staffing shortages are a big factor in the recent incidents, but the problem is, how can the FAA determine how many new controllers are needed and where to put them at a time when the shape of the industry is also changing? Also, remember those automated surface surveillance systems that warned controllers if two aircraft is getting too close to each other? Well, smaller airports often don't have these systems, and introducing them isn't cheap. So with airlines now potentially starting to use more of the smaller airports, this problem might grow unless something is done. This is made even more complicated because we don't actually know if the likes of Avelo, Breeze and other older airlines will actually continue to operate this new way from these small airports in the future. Now, that is a little bit of a long topic in itself, probably needs its own video, but basically it has to do with low fleet utilization. You see, we usually say that if an airliner is sitting on the ground, it is losing money. And that's because leasing or financing a plane is so expensive, on top of other fixed costs, of course. But airlines like Allegiant and now Avelo normally use older aircraft with very low leasing costs, and the same is true for Breeze's Embraer 190 fleet. If these costs are low, it makes more sense for the airline to, for example, cancel a flight and keep the plane on the ground if they can't fill it up with passengers. And that's something that the airlines with newer planes parked at bigger, more central and more expensive airports just can't afford to do. But can that strategy of leaving aircraft on the ground continue indefinitely? Well, back in 2021, with much of the industry still reeling from the effects of the pandemic, leasing values for older, used Airbus A320s or 737s were indeed really low, enabling this kind of thinking and new operating model to be introduced. But now, in 2023, getting those kinds of cheap leasing deals is nothing but a distant memory. And an example of this is that companies converting 737s into freighters now suddenly can't even find any aircraft to convert because lessors need all of their aircraft for passenger transports again. And this also means that the low-fare airlines out there have had to change their tactics. For the first time in years, Allegiant ordered brand new aircraft in 2022, selecting the 737 MAX over the Airbus A320 family, surprising a lot of people in the industry, including some of its own investors, by doing so. And Breeze will eventually replace its Embraers with newer Airbus A220s, which they actually have already started to receive. Now, buying new aircraft will mean a completely different and potentially higher cost base for these airlines, and it remains to be seen if the new strategy of American point-to-point will be able to support those. Whatever happens, the United States will definitely need to hire more air traffic controllers going forward. During the pandemic, training for new controllers stopped for nearly 2 years, and in the beginning of this year's summer season, staffing levels were below 85% at 77% of all critical ATC facilities, according to a recent audit.
Right now, 2 out of every 10 air traffic controller positions are vacant.
Now, restoring ATC capacity is going to be a challenge, there's no question about that. And that challenge will be bigger than simply hiring more people, because they will also need to be hired in the correct places, and the lower experience levels of controllers would have to be tightly monitored to make sure that it doesn't become a problem. But the FAA, the NTSB and other authorities out there are well aware of this. For aviation to continue to be the safest way of transport, we need well-trained, well-rested and happy air traffic controllers and pilots, and I hope that steps are taken to make sure that this continues to be the case even with these challenges that we're now facing. But what do you think? I love hearing from you, so let me know in the comments below, and if you want daily aviation news, well then check out my website mentorpilot.com or get my app at app.mentorpilot.com. If you want to support the work that me and my team does here on the channel, well then consider getting yourself maybe a cool t-shirt or a cup or a mug or something, or become a member of my fantastic Patreon crew. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.